get into things in just a moment with our series. We've been working through a book called 1 Corinthians in the New Testament of the Bible. It was originally a letter written to a church from a person called the Apostle Paul in the Bible. He was an early follower of Jesus. He used to be a part of a group of Jewish people called the Pharisees that very much were opposed to Jesus when he was doing ministry for about 3 or 3.5 years before his death and resurrection. But afterwards, Paul had a 180-degree shift where he went from persecuting Jesus and his followers to one of the biggest supporters and proponents of Jesus all throughout the Roman world. And so we're reading some caring words from Paul to this church. They asked him some questions, and so he's weighing in on some of those things. And just to kind of give you some context so you don't just feel like you're thrown into the middle of somewhere that you have no reference for, recently in this letter, in chapter 5, in the beginning of chapter 6, he's been talking about this issue of judging and how normally in church communities when people start judging each other, it causes more harm than good. But there are some situations where we kind of have to discern or judge or weigh in or confront situations or correct things that are happening. And one of those instances is when people are being abused or harmed in a church community. We can't just let that go unchecked because abuse causes harm, and that's not what Jesus' community is about. Another time when the church is urged to kind of step in and make some corrections, correct their course, is when they're representing Jesus to the community around them. The community gets the wrong idea about what a church of Jesus followers is really about. And one of the ways that Paul weighed in on that last week was in the court systems. Some people in this church in ancient Corinth and ancient Greece were taking each other to court. And the court system in ancient Rome and ancient Greece was very biased. The more money you had, the more status you had, the more chance you had of winning your case. And so people who had those benefits in life would file lawsuits against people of lower classes with less resources, and they'd win every time. And so it was just a way to kind of humiliate people. And there were people in the church that were doing that. And Paul says that's not a good representation of who Jesus is to the community. And now he's going to weigh in on one more thing, what we're going to talk about this week in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 12 to 20. And he's going to say, just like you shouldn't use the court systems to take advantage of other people in the community, you shouldn't use your bodies to take advantage of other people in the community either. And so we're going to get into a little bit of a discussion about boundaries. What kind of boundaries should we put on our bodies as followers of Jesus? What does that really look like? And so we're going to get into some of those things today. I don't know, for some reason this clicker is not currently working, so I'm going to try to reset it and see. Is it up on it's up on there and everything? Okay. I might have to have your help with some of that if it doesn't work. But anyway, we're looking at some body boundaries today. Have you ever had to put any kind of limitation on your body? Or maybe limits on people's bodies in your family? We actually had something Christine and I did this week where we had to put a limit on our kids and what they were doing because we noticed, okay, so in this day and age, it's really easy to get sucked into social media, right? And your phones and your tablets and YouTube and all those things. And I'm not saying that we don't have an issue sometimes, Christine and I as well, with that because it's just so accessible. But we noticed that our kids were getting obsessed with playing one certain game and maybe watching a couple of different YouTube channels on their tablets to the point where it was just taking over everything else in life. And if they couldn't have time on that in the course of a day, they would just get angry and they would fight with each other and they couldn't sleep well at night. And so we had to draw a line in the sand this last week and say, we're just going to put these things on a shelf for the next week. And it's tricky because they use them with their schooling as well. But because we homeschool our kids, we decided to actually take a break from the school, the part of the school that involves the tablets even, because it was getting that insane. And what was interesting, and praise God for Christine, because she took the brunt of this. I was at work the day that the tablets were placed on the shelf, and the first 2 or 3 hours were rocky. Lots of tears, lots of complaints. But about 3 hours later, we noticed that our kids had found something to do in the backyard, and they were building forts out of sticks and just playing and focusing on each other, and they were happy. And we noticed that that boundary that they had placed on their physical body, what they could or couldn't do with it, that was actually working out okay. I don't know how it'll end up, but that's the boundary we had to place this week. And maybe you've found yourself having to place boundaries on social media consumption or just something totally different related to your bodies. And it seems like our bodies are hardwired for different things. They can be hardwired for comfort. A lot of times we want comfort, or we want companionship, or we just want some kind of creative outlet. And these are some core desires because we are people with a body. Like we are persons inhabiting a body, and that's how we've entered into life in this world. That's our confines. And so because of that, we have those different needs. We deal with different kinds of desires that are attached to our physical body all the time. For example, we need comfort. So because we desire comfort, we have this desire for food. We also have a desire for shelter. We have a desire for relief, right? Pain or discomfort's not fun. We want safety because of our bodies. If we were just a spirit floating out somewhere, these wouldn't be concerns. We desire touch because that's part of being comforted. We might desire sex or stability or structure or help or all these things because we want to experience comfort with our bodies. We also want companionship. It's hard to be absolutely alone. And so because of that, we desire support, or maybe we desire belonging or love. Maybe we feel like we need or want attention, or intimacy, or value, or affirmation, or encouragement. And a lot of these things are good desires with our bodies. But if we let them go unchecked, you might be able to already see how some of these things that we desire could end up being a negative for us and end up being harmful. And so because we have these desires attached to the fact that we live in a physical body, that reality causes us to wrestle with the question of how far are we willing to go, or do we think we should go, to satisfy those desires? And that's kind of what we find Paul discussing with the church in Corinth, the ancient church in Corinth today, in this portion of 1 Corinthians in the letter. How far are they willing to go? How far would you go? Let's say you're hungry. Would you work a job to satisfy your hunger? Would you beg to satisfy your hunger? Would you farm to satisfy your hunger? If you're not outdoorsy, would you steal to satisfy your hunger? Would you kill to satisfy your hunger? Where do we put the boundaries on these things? How do we decide where to draw the lines? And that's what we're going to encounter today. And as we step into these verses, I just want to mention something. There are a few statements that are given in these verses that a lot of scholars and most Bible translation teams believe are actually Paul quoting things that the Corinthians have said to him in the past. And then he quotes them and then refers to it and answers that from his perspective, his point of view. What makes it tricky when we read our Bibles is the translation teams do their best to put things in quotation marks where they think they belong, but the ancient Greek language the New Testament was written in didn't have punctuation. So it makes it a little difficult to figure out what's a quote and what's not. And so just realize that as we navigate some of these things, I'm going to tell you what a lot of scholars and translation teams have landed on and my personal opinions, but just know there's a little bit of room for fluidity and maybe a difference of opinion on these things because we don't absolutely know. But I'll tell you my thoughts and we'll go from there. First, we find Paul talking about some parameters. How do we put parameters on our body? How do we figure out what the boundaries are for somebody who says they're a follower of Jesus Christ? And here's how the verse starts. It says, all things are permitted, which has the idea of being lawful. Better translation would probably be socially acceptable because it's this idea of other people are looking at your life and some things society permits and some things people in society are just like, no, that's a no-go. So all things are permitted or socially acceptable for me. And then the verse says, but not all things are a benefit. And that word benefit has the idea of relationally beneficial, bringing people together, right? Some things are divisive, some things harm relationships, and other things bring people together. And then it says again, all things are permitted, socially acceptable for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. I won't be controlled by anything or dominated by anything. And so a lot of people believe that statement, all things are permitted, socially acceptable for me, is actually something that the Corinthians had told Paul. We know that this is not the first letter Paul has written to the Corinthian church, but we don't have the previous letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. We also know he spent 2 years there, and we don't know all the conversations that happened over the course of 2 years. But a lot of people, when they're reading Paul's logic in here, they believe that Paul is repeating something the Corinthians thought, some of the Corinthians thought. And that was that basically anything that is socially acceptable is fine for me as a follower of Jesus. That's the line. As long as it's socially acceptable, then I can do whatever I want in that realm with my body. And as a follower of Jesus, it's fine. And so what we think Paul's doing is he's weighing in and saying, but here's a couple of things to think about, right? Because in Roman society, let me have you go to the next one really fast here. So in Roman society, if we're going by what's socially acceptable, here's the list, just a part of the list. Prostitution, it's always socially acceptable as long as it's with someone of a lower class, a lower status in society. Sexual relationships with minors, that's allowable. Marriage happens around age 12 for girls, and all types of activities and abuses outside of that realm, socially acceptable. Pedestry, which is, just to put this lightly, I'm trying to gauge who all's in the room because I try to be sensitive if we have younger people in the room, but essentially there were relationships where older men would be sexually abusive of young men in society, think preteens or teenagers, and there were relationships where in the context of that was okay. Affairs, as long as it was between a man who was married with an unmarried woman, that was fine. Verbal abuse, as long as you're a higher status than the person you're verbally abusing, completely fine. Lawsuits, as long as it's against someone of a lower class or an equal class, it's fine. Substance abuse, it's fine. Slavery, it's fine. Now let's look at our society for a moment. Here are some things that are socially acceptable. Maybe not in every social place, but you're probably not going to be thrown in jail for these things, and you're probably not even going to be arrested for these types of things. Prejudice. Can you be prejudiced here in the United States? Sure you can. Free speech. Can you say whatever you want? For the most part. If it's defamatory and it's slander or libel in print, you're saying false things that cause harm to people, there are some laws. But for the most part, just open up social media and you'll see that free speech is alive and well, for better or for worse. Sex, allowed between consenting adults in the United States. Pornography, allowed. Affairs, allowed. More so than in ancient Rome, actually. No one's going to, throw you in jail for having an affair. Verbal abuse, as long as you don't physically threaten someone, it's fine. Emotional abuse, it's allowable. I'm saying legally allowable. Substance abuse, allowed. Sure, we have some parameters, but overall. Gender pay gap, allowed. Statistically, women make, 70 to 80% of what men make in our society. Many companies across the board do this. It's fine. I mean, people haven't been able to bring that into a court situation and legislate it. Discrimination against minorities. This could be women, could be immigrants, LGBTQ plus community, indigenous peoples. For the most part, allowed, unless you're causing physical harm. There's lines, but for the most part, you can discriminate. Even sometimes legislatively, there can be discrimination in America. Homelessness can be criminalized. Unlivable wages are allowable. Excessive health care billing is allowable. My father retired recently from working for a hospital for 50 years. And we were having a conversation one time, and he said, did you know that most of what patients are billed for, about 30% of that is what it actually costs the hospital. So they're billing you 100%, but only 30% of that bill is what it cost. I was like, that's interesting. Interest rates, excessive ones. Think your credit card, 29, 30% interest. It's allowed. It's fine. There's actually no ceiling on that. A credit card could charge you 100% interest if somebody was foolish enough to get one. Profiting at other people's expenses. That's perfectly allowable, right? You can do that in business, especially using people in other countries who are making very little in order to sell a product here for cheap. It's fine. There's a lot of things in our society that are permissible by that society. And so Paul's going to give us some metrics for evaluating those things. And the first thing that he says in that verse is, but not all things are of benefit. Not all things bring us together. Kind of in other words, what he's saying there is that some things are going to divide relationships, right? Some things that might be allowed in 2024 in the United States are going to harm your relationships with people. Some things that might be allowable in ancient Corinth and the Roman Empire are going to harm your relationships with people. And so if it's going to cause that kind of harm, maybe you should put up a boundary and not allow your body to do that thing. The second thing he says toward the end, he says, I will not be mastered by anything. And so maybe some of the things that you're going to, that society would say, that's fine, you can do that with your body. It's actually something that's going to start to control you. You're going to become the slave of something. It's going to start to dominate you, and you'll no longer be in control of that thing, but it will be in control of you. And so again, Paul's kind of painting a broad stroke with a big brush here, just saying overall, as you think about the things in your society that are permissible, think about those two things. What's going to divide relationships, and what's going to start to dominate you and control you? If something will, maybe you should put up a boundary there. And Paul's not going to tell us all the ins and outs and every single boundary we should put in place. He's just kind of causing us to start to think in that sense. We're going to move on into verse 12 as well. I'm sorry, not verse 12, verse 13. Yeah. And so in verse 13, he's going to talk about a different thing that the Corinthian believers were basing their body boundaries on. So one thing was what society says. That's where I'm going to draw my lines. A second thing was what their own bodies craved or desired. It says food is for the stomach and stomach is for the food. However, God will do away with both of them. And most scholars and Bible translation teams think that the first part of that is definitely something that Paul's quoting back to the Corinthians. The Corinthians at one point in time have just made this claim, food's for the stomach, stomach's for the food. Any kind of physical desire, it doesn't have any spiritual bearing at all because it's just a biological desire. So it doesn't matter. So just let the body have whatever the body wants. Some people think that Paul's saying, but God's going to do away with both of them. But it's interesting because when Paul says something in the next few verses, Paul's actually pointing out that God's going to resurrect the body. So it's important. And so my personal thought is I think that the second part of this verse is also something the Corinthians were saying. Like, what we do with our physical bodies, it doesn't matter because someday they're going to die. They're going to be done away with, and they're going to go in the grave. So it doesn't really matter what we do with our bodies. So just satisfy whatever desires, whatever cravings you have. You're completely free to do that. Is that why the body exists? And so Paul's going to weigh in on that next as well. He says, but, in the next phrase, the body is not for sexual immorality. Now he's getting specific, okay? And there's a reason why, because he's going to mention something that's a huge issue in the church in Corinth, and it's actually men visiting prostitutes. This is something that's happening a lot and no one has a problem with. And so he's going to say, let's use this food is for the stomach, stomach is for the food thing in the case of immorality, sexual immorality. In that case, he's saying the body desires that, but the body is not for that. It's for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. He says, now God has not only raised the Lord, but will raise us up through his power. And so Paul is saying, the body doesn't really exist just to satisfy its physical desires. It exists to satisfy and be satisfied by Jesus. And ultimately, it should be lived in now like it's going to be raised for a completely different purpose, for honoring God all the time at some point in the future. And so maybe as you're making your choices, you shouldn't just look to what your body craves. You should look to what will satisfy Jesus. And maybe look at how you think you'll be living someday when you are raised from the dead and you're living forever with Christ. How will you live then? Maybe those should be some parameters that you should put on your bodies. Next, he's going to go into some purposes. He's saying, here's some practical filters, and now let's think about the purpose of our bodies in the first place. This is in verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are parts of Christ? Shall I then take away the parts of Christ and make them parts of a prostitute? Far from it. So that's where he's getting more specific, and he's saying, in your situation, do you really think that you're justified to do this? And he points us to a metaphor. He compares people who are following Jesus to parts of Jesus' body. And he talks about taking away a part of Jesus. Do you think if somebody chopped your arm or your hand off, you'd care? Do you think if somebody took your foot off, you might feel some pain? You would, right? And so Paul, by using this imagery, it's almost the idea that these people are taking themselves away from carrying out Jesus' purpose, being parts of his body, and almost like chopping themselves off of the body of Christ. And he uses that metaphor of the body to refer to the church, the community of people following Jesus. And so he's saying, you're taking people out of this community who are working for Christ. You're kind of chopping yourselves off by doing this thing when you should be serving people and empowering people and comforting people, mediating difficult situations, encouraging, speaking out. Some people instead are spending their time with prostitutes, and they're not accomplishing any of the things that Christ intended them to accomplish. So he's saying, isn't your purpose, again, to carry out Christ's work, but instead you're joining in and you're carrying out the work of prostitution with your body. Do you see anything wrong with that? We can go on to the next slide. Verse 16, he gives another purpose. He says, or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says the two shall become one flesh. So he's talking about there's a level of intimacy there. But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. And then he says, flee sexual immorality. And so in that verse, Paul's making a comparison between sexual intimacy and spiritual intimacy. They're really eager for sexual intimacy with prostitutes, but the thrill of spiritual intimacy with Jesus by becoming one in spirit with Jesus, that's kind of like gotten placed on the back burner. They've forgotten about that. And I think it is actually thrilling to see your spirit change. I had an experience, my sophomore year in college was probably the most vivid, where I saw God just really changing the way that I saw life and the way that I cared about people. And I noticed it in several different ways. I started to read through my Bible and really crave that, the New Testament, my first and second year of college. And as I did that, I saw more and more of who Jesus was, and it was intriguing and captivating, and it really challenged my perspective in the way that I was living. Like so much so that I saw God shift my whole purposes. I had an opportunity at the beginning of my sophomore year to get into a dating relationship with a girl that I'd worked with and met that previous summer, who was a great person. But God was doing so many things in my life at that point in time that I actually wanted to put a priority on continuing to get to know him and serving in different ways. And I knew that a relationship at that point in time in my life, it would actually cause me not to be able to progress in those things. And so I try to be polite about it, but I was just like, I feel like right now, instead of a relationship, God wants me to focus on these other things, like getting to know him more. And just had some incredible conversations with people, and I was involved in a church situation that had amazing worship, and God was just, he was showing me the thrill of what it was like to actually get to know and follow Jesus for the first time. And that's what these people were missing out on. And they thought life, as good as life gets, is spending a night with a prostitute. And Paul's like it gets so much better. You could become one in spirit with Jesus, and he could totally transform the way that you live life and your understanding, and you're missing out on that. That's another purpose. Third purpose, he says, every other sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. And so he's dealing with the issue of sin. And in the Bible, one of the ways that sin is portrayed, it's with the metaphor as well, and it's like you're shooting an arrow at a target and you miss. You're off target. And the idea is back to the Garden of Eden. God gives humanity an opportunity in the beginning. And that opportunity is either listen to me and let me shape your concept of what good is and what bad is and how you navigate life in this world that I placed you in. Or you can just figure things out for yourselves. And the way that you can tell me what you've chosen is by either avoiding picking a fruit on this tree in the middle of the garden, or you can take it. The tree is called the knowledge of good and evil. And so you can take the knowledge of knowing good and evil into your own hands and pick it and take it for yourself. Or you can leave it and trust me with that and let me reveal what that is. Or you can snatch it, and possess it yourselves and try to figure it out yourselves. And people selected the latter. And ever since, we've struggled with trying to figure out those differences for ourselves. And so sin would be the things that are aberrations, that are straying away from what God would say the good and beneficial way to live our lives and to treat people really is. And most of the time when we miss that target of living by God's definition of good, right, we end up hurting other people. But Paul says the unique thing about what they're doing with prostitution or any kind of like sexually abusive practice is that in the process, it doesn't just hurt other people, which it does, but it ends up hurting themselves, which I think is interesting. Like it ends up hurting themselves. How might some sort of off-target sexual practice end up hurting the person themselves that's driving it? Well, maybe it's going to cause heartache. Maybe it's going to cause heartache they didn't even expect or see coming in themselves. Not just others, but in themselves. Maybe it's going to cause addiction and start controlling and having a grasp on that person's life. Maybe it's going to result in anger. After somebody is abused or mistreated, or maybe somebody breaks off that type of uncommitted relationship, there's just immense anger. Or maybe regret. Or maybe loss of a family, like in the case of an affair. You lose your wife or husband, you lose contact with your kids perhaps. Maybe it's going to result in disease. That happens. Maybe unexpected pregnancy or fatherhood at an early age. And that starts to complicate your life physically. Maybe it's financial obligations. So now you have to work harder. Money goes less far. It's divided. You're paying support, things like that. Maybe it's criminal penalties because the things that you do are not just socially unacceptable or biblically unacceptable, but they're also legally unacceptable. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's shame that you feel. But Paul's saying with certain kinds of sin, especially sexual sins, it doesn't just affect other people. It ends up affecting the person who's perpetrating it as well. So I guess the way to wrap up this conversation and kind of head us toward a broader application as well is concerning these sexual practices that Paul's focusing in on. Again, there's many ways that we can limit our bodies, and I don't know you and you don't know me. And maybe this is an area where we have a personal need to impose some limitations. What types of things might we consider limiting with our bodies? And then we'll get to these questions that are on the screen. Would we say we should limit our bodies from prostitution? Most people in the room would probably say, yeah, I'll give you that one, Jason. We probably should avoid that as followers of Jesus. Rape probably has some serious legal penalties. Incest, to a lot of us, that's still distasteful even in our society. Sex with minors, very looked down on in our country, even though it wasn't in ancient Rome. Affairs, this kind of gets a little more gray for some people, but we can see how that can damage people's lives. It's unfaithfulness to a marriage commitment. But then again, things get more challenging for people. Sexual harassment, what about that? Maybe still the majority of people would say, yeah, I probably should avoid that, especially in our context with that becoming more and more of an issue that's looked down on in our society today, that's become a huge issue and a problem. But what about things like this? Have you ever heard of swinging? Do you know what that is? Some of you might not. Others of you do. It's a big tendency, not only throughout the United States, but even in Utah, for couples who are married to get together with other couples who are married and share each other. It's a common thing. There's websites where you can find other people. There's certain types of clothing you can wear to indicate that that's who you are. There's places even in St. George where people frequent who are looking for shared open marriages, shared relationships. And that's becoming a huge thing. There are thousands of people in our own state that engage in completely open marriages. So what about that? What about casual sex if it's between single adults? Is that an issue? What about pornography? I mean, after all, you're not really harming a person, are you? But think about that. How do people get the images in the first place? Are people shamed or harmed or sometimes abused or forced into situations to bring those images about? In most situations, definitely. How are people affected? And then again, how does that affect a person? Is there domination that can come over someone's life as a result of entering down that trail? What about unwanted physical touch? Should that be a boundary? What about dirty jokes? Is it okay to share them? Is it okay to laugh at them? What about mental longings and lust? Where do we draw the lines? These are the kinds of boundaries that we have to consider, even in our society, in the area of sex. But then there are all these other areas that this question broadens out to, which is why I have these questions here. How can we determine boundaries for our bodies? I think Paul would say, in a nutshell, here's some great questions to ask. One, is the action I'm taking with my body, is it dividing relationships? Is it having a harmful impact on my relationships with people or other people's relationships with each other? If it is, maybe we need to put a boundary in place. Is the action I'm taking with my body dominating me? Am I being controlled? Am I forming an addiction? Even if it's my tablet or my social media profile, like, is whatever I'm doing with this starting to control me? If so, maybe I need to impose a boundary, even if for just a time. Is the action I'm taking with my body driven by selfish cravings? Is that the only driver? My selfish cravings, because I feel like, anything that causes me discomfort, anything that I feel like I need, I just need to satisfy. Some of the Corinthians were, but is that really the wisest course of action? Is the action I'm taking with my body defining life and the resurrection? Could I see myself one day when I'm dead and gone with the Lord, and then one day Christ resurrects my body like he said he would, and like the New Testament many places says God will one day do? Would I see myself in this new resurrected, healed body that has, the correct definition of good and bad, that's with Christ face to face, that's with God in his presence forever? Would that body, which is really going to be the same body, just changed a bit, made immortal in different ways, would I take this body then and do the stuff with it then that I'm doing now? And if the answer is no, maybe there needs to be a boundary. So these are just practical tools for kind of deciding what we do with our bodies that we have, and there's so many different things. I want to close what we're doing today with an opportunity for us to reflect on another final purpose of our bodies, or just a reality that's attached to our bodies, and that's the fact that our bodies are not just our own. If we're followers of Jesus, they've been bought with a price. So this is how Paul closes off that section. He says, do you all, this is another curious thing in the New Testament, when the word you is used, it's hard to tell if it's talking about you as in one person or you as in all of you, or y'all. And at the end, Paul switches to not just the individual you, he switches to the plural you that means all of you. So I put that in brackets. He says, do you all not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you? What body do we all share? Well, Jesus, but really this church, right? So now Paul's zooming out and he's saying, do you not know that your collective body, you as a church community, as parts of Christ, you form a temple of the Holy Spirit within you all, whom you all have from God, and that you all are not your own. He's saying, for you all have been bought for a price. For this reason, you should honor God in your body. So he's saying the final purpose that our bodies exist for is actually to honor God. But the reasoning is that we've been bought for a price. Why did we have to be bought for a price? Well, there was a price that we paid, that humanity paid, when humanity decided to deviate from God's instructions, to take the fruit from the tree, and everyone in generations after that decided to do their own thing in one form or another. And so when we as people decided, we know better than you, God, we will take the reins, we will do things our way. God told Adam and Eve with that first choice, the result of that is going to be death. So that became the price. The curse, so to speak, that fell on people from that point ever since. Not just physical death, but death in a spiritual sense. Because from that moment on, Adam and Eve and our relationship with God is also separated. It's been wrecked. There's a rift there. And so it's a spiritual type of death and it's a physical type of death. And so the price was death, which is why years and years and years later, when God was looking for a rescue and looking for a solution, he came himself. Jesus came, and he paid with his life. He paid the death that was looming over all of us, that resulted in our separation from God, that resulted in our bodies dying and decaying and our physical health deteriorating over time. He paid that price for us. And so Paul is saying, Jesus, he gave his life for us to restore our connection with God. It was a debt looming over us that he cleared out of the way so that we could now, instead of being held to that and under the weight of that debt, we could exist in a free and clear relationship with God. And so because of that, how should we live?